The current map of Palestine is often described as resembling Swiss cheese. Over the past century, it has been carved up, walled up, and filled with hundreds of illegal Israeli settlements and military checkpoints. Now, in the latest round of Israel's ongoing occupation and policy of land grabs, this map could become even more disjointed. On July 1, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is expected to announce Israel's annexation of the Jordan Valley and Northern Dead Sea. Annexation is a term used when a regime unilaterally incorporates another territory within its borders. Annexing the Jordan Valley would mean that Israel would officially consider it part of its regime. International law is very clear. Annexation and territorial conquest are forbidden by the Charter of the United Nations. Yet Israel continues to occupy Palestine and now plans on looting more Palestinian land and resources. Opponents of annexation, even inside the illegal Israeli settlements, believe that if Israel moves ahead with plans to annex parts of the occupied West Bank and Jordan Valley, they will have no choice but to declare their adopted homeland occupation as a modern-day version of apartheid-era South Africa. There will be Israeli overlords in an occupied area, and the people over whom they will be ruling will not have basic rights. Yeah, I know, as if Palestinians were enjoying all the sorts of basic rights before this new annexation plan, as if this has not been the case since 1948. Despite the existence of the Palestinian Authority, Israel has ultimate de facto control over the West Bank. It controls entry and exit, water and all other resources, and overall security. Even under useless interim peace accords, Israel also maintains full control over 60% of the West Bank, where all illegal settlements are located and tens of thousands of Palestinians live but have no voice. It's appalling to Palestinians that only now critiques of annexation view Israel as an apartheid regime, when several years back the Israeli parliament passed its national state law, which declared the country to be the national home of the Jewish people, while downgrading the status of all Palestinians, whether Muslims, Christians, or secular. Welcome to the Mideastream. I'm Marwa Osman. Benjamin Netanyahu has announced the time would be ripe on July 1 for his regime to permanently seize Palestinian territory by annexing swathes of the West Bank and the Jordan Valley. In the meantime, Palestinians called on political leaders in the Arab world and the Muslim world to join hands in defense of the Palestinian cause and devise mechanisms to stop Israel's plan. To discuss this issue with us from the occupied West Bank is Dr. Amal Wahdan, human rights advocate. Thank you very much for being with us, Dr. Amal. Now, Israel has run a military occupation for more than half a century that has created a situation in which Palestinian officials say there is already de facto annexation there. How is July 1st going to be different from the previous years?
Yeah, actually, this is a good point. And to straight the records, Palestinians have been living under this occupation since 1948, so there is no difference between 1948 and 1967. We are one homeland and one people. So this annexation is actually announcing it formally in front of the world, while actually we are living under occupation. This illusion of the peace process that has been imposed on the Palestinian people for 25 years actually materialized this fact that the people have gained no peace, the people have gained no statehood, and no future plans to do such in the current situation. So this annexation plan is formally announcing that the Zionist regime is going ahead with its balkanization of Palestine and dividing it into small cantons in the West Bank, I mean. And Gaza is separated. So, and Jerusalem is also another geography. So what is left for the Palestinians?
Well,
So,
Dr. Wahdan, we have heard the
continuation.
Palestinians. The Palestinians are defiant. They say that they will not just sit and let this go by. This move actually means for them the loss of vital land that constitutes their homeland, that constitutes the possibility of them having self-determination in the future and eventually having a Palestinian state for all Palestinians, whether inside Palestine or abroad. Might this poorly calculated move by Netanyahu and Trump lead maybe to a highly awaited Palestinian unity that would exert heavy pressure on apartheid Israel?
Yes, actually, this is our chance now to unite our efforts under the occupation and Palestinians all over the world with the, of course, support of the axis of resistance and Arab people as well. And the international free people. So this is the last chance that we have. We either stand united against this occupation and forget about the illusion of the peace process because it didn't give us anything for 25 years and will not give us anything because it always blocked by this Zionist project. The Zionist projects, as Danny Odin said before, is to balkanize the whole area, not only Palestine. It says that it goes from the brooks of Egypt to the Euphrates. So their project, their Zionist project for greater Israel is continuing. That's why we have to fight it as Palestinians and as Arabs.
That is the option left within Palestine. But we have heard much of the global community looking on with concern to what is going to happen this week, supposedly this week, by the Israeli regime. They say it's a clear violation of international law, while warning that there's an echo of what they call hot summer boiling with tension this year. But this is such a cliche of the international community. Why is it so hard for the UN, or at least the member states who are concerned, really concerned for the Palestinian statehood? Why don't they just call it as it is, maybe sanction Israel, and if persisted with the aggressive policies that it is doing right now and continuing against the Palestinian people, sanction it, punish it, say something?
Okay, these vocabularies that they use about the international community. Who is the international community? Are we talking about the European Union? Are we talking about the US, Canada? These are, or the NATO, for example, NATO countries. They are joining forces with Israel. They're backing up Israeli project because it's one of their own projects. What's happening in Palestine or what's happening in the whole Arab countries today, during this whole Arab Spring between brackets, is a project that was led by the USA. So the international community is a fake expression trying to mislead the whole world about what is going on. And the UN actually is an arm, or it's an organization that is led by these colonial forces. So the UN has nothing, has no power or incompetent to do anything in regard to sanctioning Israel between brackets, while the U.S. is doing this against Syria, against Iran, against China, against Russia. The U.S. is doing this bilaterally, and sometimes the UN go with it. So it's hard to depend on the international law at the moment with this UN as an international organization. I think with the global multilateral global powers arising now, they should be looking for a different kind of regional and global organization that looks into the interest of the countries and looks into the interest of the people rather than being pulled by the USA
briefly
and
here,
its allies.
Dr. Wahdan, going back to the Palestinian issue and the authority that supposedly is looking into the maybe the Palestinian benefit or the Palestinian rights. We have the Palestinian Authority led by the President Mahmoud Abbas, who says that Trump's conspiracy deal will not pass, while we see it passing with every phase, without hindering, especially without any real hampering that is coming from the Palestinian authorities. If this plan passes on the first week of July, what more legitimacy would the Palestinian authorities have left facing the Palestinian people?
They will be left with nothing. Actually, it's too late for them to announce this, that they want to confront, that they want to dissolve the Palestinian Authority and give the keys to the occupation. I think they went really late. 25 years of deception and 25 years of illusion had left us nothing. That's why we are now facing this annexation plan, because the PA wasn't strong enough from the beginning to stand up for the Palestinian rights. Being late now, it's better than not come at all. So let's see what's going to happen. And since we are living under occupation,
for sure this will be a very divisive week for the Palestinian Authority, for the Palestinian people, and for the Israeli regime itself, and how it will deal with this upcoming catastrophe in the Palestinian territories. I want to thank you very much, Dr. Amal Wahdan, from the occupied West Bank, a human rights advocate, for joining us to talk about the possible annexation of the West Bank and the Jordan Valley. Thank you for being with us, and please stay tuned for our next segment. The conflict in Libya has taken a new turn. Egypt's President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi's threat to take military action if the city of Sirte or the strategic Jufra airbase fall to Turkish-backed forces. Additionally, another dangerous layer to a conflict already beset with outside powers seeking influence. Egypt threatens military action in Libya in this following report. Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi has upped the ante in the chaotic conflict in Libya, warning that Cairo would intervene militarily to halt a march eastwards by the Turkey-backed forces of the UN-recognized government. Sisi's tough words came after the Tripoli-based Government of National Accord (GNA) pushed back the forces of Eastern strongman Khalifa Haftar, defeating his 14-month bid to capture the Libyan capital. The Egyptian president warned that if pro-GNA forces advanced on the strategic city of Sirte, some 450 kilometers east of Tripoli, it could provoke direct intervention by Cairo. The stalemated offensive in Tripoli by Sisi's ally Haftar crumbled after Turkey threw its military weight behind the GNA. With Ankara's support, the GNA has scored a series of military victories and vowed to move further to retake the coastal city of Sirte, a gateway to Libya's key oil export ports. Sisi's declaration was backed by the Speaker of Libya's eastern-based parliament, Aguila Saleh, and allies in the region, including Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Jordan. But it drew the ire of the GNA, which denounced it as a declaration of war. Egypt's long and porous desert border with Libya has been a major concern for Cairo, especially since the 2011 overthrow of Libya's former president Muammar al-Gaddafi triggered chaos in the country. Earlier this month, Egypt proposed a peace initiative for Libya, which it dubbed the Cairo Declaration, calling for a ceasefire, the disbanding of militias, and the withdrawal of mercenaries. But the plan unveiled by Sisi with Haftar at his side was dismissed by the GNA and Ankara as an attempt to buy time for the strongman's forces to regroup. Relations between Cairo and Ankara have deteriorated dramatically since Sisi led the army's 2013 ouster of his predecessor, Islamist President Mohamed Morsi, who was supported by Turkey. Now that they stand on opposing sides of the Libyan conflict, Egypt fears that militias allied with Turkey could penetrate its borders. To discuss this issue with us from London is Sami Hamdi, who is the editor-in-chief of the International Interest. Thank you for being with us. Sami, now with Sisi's recent confrontational statements, what are the chances of open war between Egypt and Turkey inside of Libya?
I think it can't be discounted. I think a lot of people have been trying to talk about the Egypt threat as if it's a bluff. But I think when you look at the circumstances on the ground, Egypt, in reality, it does feel that the threat is coming further and further east. And Egypt is already annoyed that the Libyan war has gone on for a while in what will threaten its own domestic security. There's another layer to this as well, which is the fact that it's Turkey which is pushing the move eastwards. Egypt believes that Turkey, with its presence in Libya, which looks set to be a long-term presence, will favor the Islamist parties that Sisi essentially ousted from power. And Sisi will point to Tunisia's Ghannouchi's response in his full backing of the GNA, which is a bit different from the Tunisian president's stance, which is a bit less warm towards the GNA. Sisi believes that Libya, now that Haftar has failed to take the Tripoli offensive, there should be some negotiation and some talk about power sharing going on. But the Turks believe that they're on top, and Egypt does not want that to come further towards the east. So I think Egypt is not at the moment about to go to war. However, it's definitely an option on the table, and I don't think Sisi is bluffing.
Well, Sami, some observers claim that if Turkey was not actually prepared for confrontation against Egypt, it wouldn't have sent drones or Syrian mercenaries or even hardware to Libya to maybe stand in the face of the US-funded military of Egypt. This is very, very crucial. The Turkish gains are obvious, but what are the losses that might be incurred by Egypt in the event they actually do not confront Libya versus those if they did?
Well, the problem is that for Egypt, it believes that if the GNA, backed by Turkey, take Sirte and take Jufra, that essentially means that whole of the western part falls under the GNA and Turkish influence. And they believe that the GNA will not stop there. If they take Sirte and Jufra, they will push eastwards. They will try to take the oil crescent. If they take the oil crescent, they will try to take Benghazi. If they take Benghazi, they will continue eastwards. In other words, Sisi believes that the momentum will be such that Turkey and the GNA will not sit down for negotiations, especially given that the US position is neither for nor against. US is always with the winner, irrespective of who that is. For the US, we heard from Ibrahim Kalin, the Turkish advisor, who said that the US has not taken a decisive action or a decisive position in Libya. Essentially, the US believes that Turkey and Egypt are two strategic allies, and the US is essentially saying, I'm not fussed what you guys do, just make sure Russia doesn't impose itself in Libya. And herein lies the dynamics. For Egypt, it believes that if Libya falls under that Turkish influence, then essentially the influence that victory for Turkey and GNA will have wide ramifications for the domestic politics of Egypt and Sisi's position.
Well, Sami, Egypt is already currently facing two major security threats. We have the Islamic State group, the ISIS group, linked militants in the Sinai Peninsula. We have the Ethiopian plans to fill the Grand Renaissance Dam. These are very important issues that Egypt is facing right now, which poses an immediate threat to the country. Basically, the country's share of the Nile River is in a very, very harsh position. How does Sisi expect to juggle all of this while carrying Libya with him?
I think if we take these issues, I think Sinai has always been a problem ever since Egypt took it back from the Israelis during the war. In other words, Sinai has always been in an unrest as part of a wider measure to keep Egypt in check, to make sure that there is no repeat of what Abdel Nasser did or what Sadat did in terms of taking military action. I think it's more a guarantor to make sure that Egypt respects the peace process. With regards to, so I don't think Sinai will pose too much of a threat to Sisi domestically. It's a region-specific, albeit a very difficult one to deal with. With regards to Ethiopia and the Renaissance Dam, we heard yesterday from Reuters that negotiations are underway between Ethiopia, Sudan, and Egypt, and that some observers actually believe that this time there may well be an agreement, mainly because Ethiopia does not want war, but also Ethiopia insists that it will not affect Egypt in the way that it believes it will be affected. And Egypt doesn't want to go to war with Ethiopia, so it's more willing to go to talks and go to negotiations. So I don't think Ethiopia is as immediate a threat as perhaps has been touted in recent times. In fact, of all of these threats, Libya is the most major threat to Egypt. I'm not talking from a moral perspective or the like. I'm talking from a strictly political perspective and military. Libya is the major threat to Egypt's stability, mainly because Egypt, its policy in Libya, even though it's backed Haftar, it's mainly backed Haftar because it wants an end to the war and to make sure the Islamists are not the most powerful party. But if the Islamists look like they are winning, from Egypt's perspective, we're not saying the Islamists are winning, but from Egypt's perspective, if the Islamists look like they're winning and the US accepts that Turkey is going to have military bases in al-Watya and Misrata. In other words, the US is allowing Turkey to do what it wants in Libya. Egypt believes that it no longer has that lobbying effect or that ability to pressure influence Libya. So in other words, Egypt believes that if I cannot influence Libya politically, I must influence it militarily. And that's where the option of war comes from. Because as we've seen in Libya, and I just finished on this point, the tribes in Libya go with whoever is most powerful. Once upon a time, they were with Gaddafi, then they were with the NATO intervention, then they were with the Tripoli government for a while, and then they moved to Haftar. Now Haftar is weakened, some of them are switching sides. In other words, it's all about power. It's not about principles or the like.
Well,
Whoever
Sami,
is strong,
if you want to explain this to the Western audience who would be following on this issue, and you want to explain how the US might take a stance between Turkey, which is one of the biggest countries in the region, and Egypt, which is basically maybe the main ally of the US in the region, second to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. How do you think the stance of the US will be in this issue?
I think the problem that the US has is that there's no agreement in Washington itself over what the policy in Libya should be. It seems that they've gone back to the retro cowboy policy of let's just support the winner as long as our interests are not bothered, then we won't have a particular problem. And that's why the US was very quiet until Russia became such a major force in Libya. That's when the US woke up and decided that it's time to back Turkey in its intervention. And it started now to recognize the GNA that just a few months ago it was ignoring the GNA and almost seemed to be backing Haftar's advance on Tripoli. For the US knows one thing. There's one guarantor or common denominator that the US knows, which encourages its foreign policy. It is that even if Turkey dominates, if Egypt dominates, if UAE dominates, whoever dominates in Libya, they will come to Washington. They will come and seek Washington support. In other words, we don't have to rush. Everybody, all roads lead to Washington in the end. And that's why, despite Russians backing Haftar, US knew that if Haftar wins, he will go to Washington. They knew that if GNA win, they will go to Washington. And indeed, Turkey, one of the clashes it now has with Russia is that it's loosening its relation with Russia and trying to go back towards the US. So if you picture yourself in Washington's position, why should you be that particular concerned if Egypt and Turkey are going to go and battle it out? At the end of the day, they're lobbying you. They're coming to Washington. They're pouring the money in Washington. And this is why when we look at the US perspective, the question that should be asked is this: is the US losing anything? And the answer in reality is no, unless Russia secure a military base in Jufra, and that's why US is insistent on trying to rein in Russian influence, and it's pressuring both Egypt and Turkey to that effect. But it may be Russia will outdo the US.
Basically, Sami, this is where we see Egypt's concern. They are very much concerned. Sisi, he's watching the Russian-Turkish positioning with grave concern, given the fact that both the Turkish side and the Russian side have made several agreements in Syria that were actually effective on the ground, and seemingly they are going the same way in Libya as well. But Egyptian officials know well that both Turks and Russians are in Libya to stay there, putting their hands on oil production operations and likely, of course, to set course for further expansion in Africa. Wouldn't it be more efficient here if Egypt would get involved diplomatically rather than just up the ante knowingly that they might lose?
Egypt I think it's important to note that while Russia and Turkey have come up with effective agreements in Syria, and that's very true, in Libya it's slightly more complicated. And indeed, the Turks have sort of found this courage to stand up to Russia when it comes to Libya, possibly trying to vent that frustration at being strong-armed and manhandled by Russia in Syria. And the evidence of this is that when Sisi made his peace plan, the Cairo peace plan, that would lead to elections in Libya, the first outlet to report it was Russia Today. It was a Russia-Egypt led initiative. And indeed, the Russians and the Egyptians are cooperating quite well when it comes to Libya so far. Because when you think about it, Egypt doesn't want Sirte and Jufra to go to Turkey. And if Jufra stays under LNA, under Haftar's control, it will eventually go to the Russians as a military base. But if Turkey takes it, it's unlikely to give it to Russia as a military base. So
I want to thank you very much. Unfortunately, that's all the time we had. It's been a pleasure listening to your analysis of this situation. Sami Hamdi, Editor-in-Chief of the International Interest, thank you for being with us and explaining the issue between Egypt, Turkey and Russia inside of Libya. Thank you very much, and please stay tuned next week for more from the Mideastream.